It was still dark when the first low rumbles echoed across the horizon. The clock on the command post wall read 6:35 a.m., 5 minutes before the time Ukrainian intelligence had predicted. Soldiers exchanged tense glances. They had been told Russia would strike at dawn. Every sound mattered now. A stray gust of wind could feel like an engine. A creak of metal could sound like an artillery shell being loaded. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist, the Russian assault was forming. Ukraine's survival had never depended so much on timing, and Russia, without realizing it, was walking straight into the jaws of a machine it could not see. For weeks, Kyiv had been receiving fragments of intelligence, signals intercepted from Russian field radios, satellite images showing odd movements of armor in the eastern regions, reports from partisans deep behind enemy lines. And they would be ready. In a sealed underground room beneath a nondescript building in Kyiv, Ukraine's general staff gathered night after night, studying the patterns. Maps littered the table. Red pins marked suspected Russian staging areas. Blue pins showed defensive strongpoints. Yellow pins represented decoy positions, empty trenches, fake artillery made of logs and canvas, designed to lure Russian fire. At the center of the table lay a clock, ticking away. If they come at 6:40, one commander said, "We'll give them exactly what they want, then turn it against them." The plan was dangerous, risky. If even a single step failed, Ukraine's defenses could collapse. But the alternative, waiting passively, meant devastation. So they built the trap, not in a day, not in a week, but over long nights of planning, with help that reached far beyond Ukraine's borders. While the world believed America's role in the war was limited to weapons and logistics, behind closed doors, U.S. Navy advisors were quietly shaping the details. Not with boots on the ground, but with algorithms, surveillance feeds, and decades of experience in naval warfare that suddenly found a new purpose on land. Because this was not just a land battle. It was a war of signals, timing, and deception, and few understood timing like the Navy. By the last week of preparation, Ukrainian units had begun repositioning under the cover of darkness. Entire artillery batteries were moved from expected zones to hidden ravines. Drone teams relocated their command vans into barns and underground shelters. Bridges and roads were mined, not randomly, but in precise choke points calculated to channel the Russians exactly where Ukraine wanted them. Soldiers whispered about the clock trap, though few knew its details. All they were told was simple: hold your fire until the signal. The signal, they learned, would not be a flare or a radio command. It would be silence. The eerie silence of the first Russian salvos failing to meet their targets. Because at 6:40, when Russia's artillery opened fire, their rounds would land on empty trenches, decoys, and ghost positions. What followed would be chaos. The Russians, convinced they had broken Ukraine's line, surging forward into corridors already locked in Ukrainian sights. And so, the night before the attack, the air was electric. Ukrainian troops crouched in bunkers, some praying quietly, some staring blankly at photographs of families they might never see again. Drones buzzed overhead, unseen, transmitting live feeds back to command. On the Black Sea, U.S. Navy surveillance assets picked up faint Russian radio chatter, confirming the countdown had begun. "They're coming," one officer whispered, "and they don't know what's waiting." The sky was a deep steel gray when the first Russian artillery thundered. The ground trembled. Shells ripped through what looked like defensive trenches, but when the smoke cleared, the Russians saw little movement. Encouraged, their commanders ordered the advance. Columns of armor pushed forward, engines roaring, treads crushing frozen soil. Infantry moved close behind, rifles ready. They expected shattered defenders, broken morale, and retreat. Instead, what they found was a silence more terrifying than any resistance. At exactly 6:40 a.m., the trap closed. Hidden artillery batteries opened fire from positions the Russians had never detected. Precision rockets, guided not by guesswork but by real-time U.S. satellite feeds, struck the leading tanks. Anti-tank teams, lying in wait with American-supplied javelins, picked off vehicles one by one. Ukrainian drones swarmed overhead, dropping explosives onto fuel trucks and command vehicles, cutting the Russians' advance in half. Panic spread as columns stalled. Some Russian commanders screamed into radios for air support, but even their helicopters found themselves ambushed. Ukraine had moved mobile air defense units into positions massed until the last second. And yet, the most devastating blow wasn't just firepower. It was psychology. For months, Russia had boasted of overwhelming numbers, of a grinding war of attrition. But here, in a single morning, they found themselves trapped inside a battlefield they thought they controlled. Every road they tried was blocked. Every field they entered had mines waiting. Their artillery, believing it had destroyed Ukrainian defenses, now found itself firing blind while Ukraine struck back with deadly precision. Soldiers reported the horrifying realization that they weren't advancing, they were being herded. By 7:15 a.m., the Russians had lost dozens of vehicles. By 7:40, their advance had ground to a halt. And by 8 o'clock, a chilling truth was clear. Ukraine hadn't just survived the morning attack. They had turned it into a slaughter. But this was only the beginning. Because what happened that morning was not simply a battle. It was the unveiling of a new kind of warfare, where deception, timing, and silent allies across oceans decided the fate of armies. Russia had underestimated Ukraine before, but after 6:40 a.m., they would never again assume the battlefield was theirs alone. And yet, even as the smoke cleared, questions began to rise. How had Ukraine known the exact time of the strike? How deep did U.S. involvement really go? And was this trap just the first step in a much larger, more dangerous game? The answers, hidden in encrypted messages, Black Sea patrols, and whispers in NATO corridors, would soon reveal that 6:40 a.m. was not an ending. It was a warning. The battlefield was eerily quiet after the first wave collapsed. Smoke curled upward from burning tanks, black columns that marked where Russia's advance had faltered. Ukrainian soldiers, still crouched in their firing positions, exchanged stunned looks. The trap had worked, better than anyone dared hope. But no one celebrated. They knew Russia would not stop here. The morning had only just begun, and the real storm was still on its way. In command centers across Russia's occupied zones, officers slammed fists on tables. Reports poured in, armor columns immobilized, dozens of vehicles lost, infantry scattered. The carefully timed 6:40 assault had unraveled in less than an hour. Panic mixed with disbelief. How did they know? One commander muttered, staring at maps that no longer made sense. For weeks they had studied Ukraine's defensive lines. For weeks they had prepared for this hour. And yet, Ukraine had seemed to vanish, only to reappear like phantoms, striking from every direction. The Kremlin was furious. Within minutes, encrypted channels lit up with urgent orders. Push reinforcements, regain momentum, strike harder. But reinforcements moved blindly into corridors Ukraine had already mapped, and every step deeper brought them into deadlier zones. For the Russians, it felt less like a battle and more like walking into a maze designed by ghosts. At 9 a.m., Russian drones were launched in desperation to locate Ukrainian artillery. Most never returned. Ukrainian electronic warfare units, guided by NATO's satellite intelligence, jammed their signals and sent them spiraling into the earth. Those that survived sent back images of trenches that looked manned but were empty, convincing Russian commanders to shell decoys, while real Ukrainian positions remained untouched. It was a brutal lesson. The trap was not just guns and mines. It was a theater of illusions, crafted with ruthless precision. Meanwhile, deep under the Black Sea, U.S. Navy submarines monitored every encrypted Russian transmission. Though Washington officially denied direct combat involvement, the truth was far less simple. Advanced electronic listening systems, some stationed on naval vessels just beyond contested waters, fed streams of intelligence to NATO analysts. Every Russian command, every movement order, every shift in radio frequency was noted. It was information Ukraine could never have accessed alone, and it gave them a terrifying edge. In Kyiv, the general staff watched in silence as drone feeds painted a picture of the battlefield. Flames licked at Russian vehicles, black smoke blotted out the morning sun, and yet, in the chaos, they saw opportunity. "Do not pursue," one commander said firmly. "Let them think we are holding. The second wave will be larger. That's when we strike." And so, Ukraine waited again. By noon, the second wave began. Reinforcements rolled forward, heavier, angrier, desperate to salvage the morning's disaster. Tanks fanned out, artillery doubled their fire, and infantry poured across fields they believed cleared. But the deeper they moved, the worse it became. Mines hidden under frost-shattered armored tracks. Snipers, concealed for hours, picked off advancing officers. Mobile rocket units struck supply convoys, igniting fireballs visible for miles. Every Russian attempt to reorganize was met with another ambush, another strike, another reminder that Ukraine was not reacting, it was controlling. Still, the Russians pressed on. Pride demanded it. The Kremlin had promised a decisive push, and failure was unthinkable. Entire battalions were thrown forward, convinced numbers would overwhelm precision. But numbers meant nothing against a battlefield wired like a trap, and Ukraine's allies ensured it stayed that way. In Norfolk, Virginia, the U.S. Navy's Cyber Operations Unit watched Russian digital chatter like hawks. Every time Russian units tried to coordinate over secure channels, the signals were intercepted, scrambled, and relayed back to Ukraine's command centers. "They're blind," one U.S. analyst whispered. "They're fighting blind." Ukrainian officers seized the advantage, striking at exactly the moments when Russian coordination faltered. By late afternoon, the cost was staggering. Dozens of tanks lay burning. Supply trucks had been annihilated. Even Russia's air support faltered. Ukrainian mobile missile systems, shifted constantly by American satellite guidance, shot down helicopters the moment they crossed the line of advance. One Russian pilot, captured later, described the battlefield as a black hole. "We flew in and never came out." But it wasn't only hardware Russia was losing. It was morale. Soldiers who had been told the Ukrainian front would collapse at dawn now saw comrades falling in droves. Commanders screamed orders into radios, but units became disorganized, retreating in panic or hesitating at crucial moments. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, Russia's great 6:40 a.m. assault had turned into a nightmare retreat. In Kyiv, exhaustion mixed with grim satisfaction. The trap had not only held, it had shattered the enemy's confidence. Yet the generals knew better than to call it a victory. Russia would return. They always did. And the trap's success raised dangerous questions. How long could Ukraine sustain this level of precision? How long before Russia adapted? And how much deeper would the United States have to step in? As dusk fell, Reports began circulating of unusual Russian movements near the Black Sea. Naval assets stirring, submarines surfacing briefly before vanishing again. It was a chilling sign. The Kremlin, humiliated on land, was now considering escalation at sea. And if the Black Sea turned hot, it would drag the U.S. Navy from the shadows into the open. That night, in a secure NATO command post, senior officers gathered to review the day. The verdict was unanimous. The trap had worked, but Russia's response would be swift. "They'll come harder," one officer said. "And next time, it won't just be tanks. It'll be missiles, maybe even naval strikes." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the unspoken truth. If Russian naval forces launched a major strike, the United States would have no choice but to act, denials or not. In a darkened office in Washington, a Navy admiral reviewed satellite images of the battlefield. He saw the smoldering wreckage, the shattered Russian formations, the precision of the Ukrainian ambush. And he whispered words that would later echo in classified reports. They relearning faster than anyone thought. He wasn't just speaking of Ukraine. He was speaking of a new kind of warfare, hybrid, relentless, and invisible to the world until it struck. For the Ukrainians, the night brought little rest. Soldiers cleaned their weapons by lantern light, some shaking from adrenaline, others numb with exhaustion. Medics worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded. Families back in villages whispered prayers, unsure if their sons would live to see morning. And across the dark waters of the Black Sea, unseen submarines shifted silently, waiting for orders that could change everything. Because the 6:40 a.m. trap, brilliant as it was, had only bought time. The real question now was simple and terrifying. How far would Russia go to erase its humiliation? And how long before the U.S. Navy stepped fully out of the shadows, no longer just the whisper behind the curtain, but a visible player in a war the world feared could ignite into something far greater? The next dawn would bring answers. But for now, Ukraine watched the horizon, waiting, because they knew the Russians would not forgive. And the clock, once again, was ticking. The night was silent, but not peaceful. Ukrainian soldiers peered into the darkness, ears straining for the faintest sounds, an engine, a drone, the distant thunder of artillery. They knew the Russians would return, but no one knew from where. Some feared another land assault at dawn. Others whispered about something worse, a strike from the Black Sea. For days, intelligence hinted that Russian naval forces had been mobilizing quietly, adjusting their positions in ways too precise to be routine. And while Ukraine could defend its skies and fields, the sea was another story. That was Russia's domain, or so they believed. At 3 a.m., a coded transmission arrived at Ukraine's southern command. It was brief, stripped of unnecessary detail. Naval movement confirmed. Estimated launch window, dawn. The officers who read it exchanged grim looks. Russia wasn't going to accept humiliation on land. They wanted to send a message, a strike powerful enough to shatter Ukraine's confidence, even if their morning assault had failed. And their best option was clear: missiles launched from warships in the Black Sea. But Russia was not the only power watching those waters. For weeks, U.S. Navy assets had tracked every Russian vessel, every submarine dive, every encrypted burst of communication. Officially, America was not engaged. At depths where sunlight never reached, submarines drifted silently, sonar arrays extended, listening to the heartbeats of Russian destroyers. On the surface, surveillance drones mapped every ripple, every shadow. And in secure rooms across Europe, NATO analysts drew lines on maps, predicting where the storm would break. Ukraine's generals knew they had a choice: wait for the missiles, or gamble everything on a preemptive strike. It was a terrifying prospect. Pitting Russian naval assets risked escalation that could drag NATO into open war. But letting those missiles fly could devastate Ukrainian cities already stretched to breaking. The decision came down to one factor: timing. If they struck too soon, the world would accuse them of provocation. If they struck too late, the cost in lives would be catastrophic. And that was when the U.S. Navy stepped out of the shadows, still unseen, still unacknowledged, but unmistakably present. Through encrypted channels, a message reached Kyiv. It contained coordinates. If you strike, the message implied, strike here. Strike now. No names were attached. No signatures. At 5:45 a.m., Ukrainian naval drone teams were awakened and briefed. Their weapons were small, remote-controlled boats packed with explosives, guided by satellite signals. Crude compared to Russia's massive fleet, but lethal if used with precision. And precision was exactly what they had been given. As the Russians prepared their launch sequence, confident Ukraine was still reeling from yesterday's battle. The first Ukrainian drones slipped silently into the Black Sea. They moved low and slow, hugging the surface, invisible to radar. Above them, U.S. satellites tracked every Russian patrol, updating their course in real time. On the other side of the horizon, hidden submarines listened as Russian captains barked final orders. And onshore, Ukrainian operators, hands trembling, guided their floating bombs toward the targets. The first detonation came at 6:40 a.m., the same cursed hour Russia had chosen the morning before. A thunderous explosion rocked the side of a Russian frigate, sending plumes of water and fire into the air. Alarms blared across the fleet. Chaos erupted. Russian crews scrambled, firing wildly, but their guns found nothing but empty waves. Within minutes, at least 2 vessels were crippled, smoke pouring from their decks. Russia had wanted to send a message. Instead, they had received one. For Ukraine, it was a miracle of coordination. For Russia, it was a humiliation beyond measure. Their mighty navy, thought untouchable in the Black Sea, had been wounded by small, almost primitive drones. And the timing, the precise, mocking timing of 6:40 a.m., was no accident. It was a signal. In Moscow, panic spread through the halls of command. The land assault had failed. The naval strike had been blunted before it began. And whispers grew louder. Ukraine was not alone. Someone powerful, invisible, was feeding them the exact timing of Russian operations. The Kremlin's suspicion fell on NATO, but naming the U.S. Navy publicly risked admitting how much control they had already lost. So instead, they fumed silently, plotting their next move. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the question everyone whispered finally demanded an answer. How had Ukraine known the Russians would strike at 6:40 a.m. twice? The truth, hidden in layers of secrecy, was more complex than anyone expected. Weeks before, a Russian officer, disillusioned and fearful, had begun leaking fragments of information. His transmissions, routed through covert channels, gave the first hint of a dawn attack. But the exact timing, the precise coordination, that had not come from him. That had come from signals intelligence far beyond Ukraine's borders. It was the U.S. Navy that had cracked the code, not by intercepting one message, but by piecing together countless fragments, patterns in radio traffic, shifts in electronic silence, the heartbeat rhythm of Russian command structures. It was a kind of warfare few understood, reading the gaps, the pauses, the invisible rhythms of an enemy too arrogant to believe it was being watched. By the time Russia finalized its orders, the Navy already knew. And Ukraine, trusting the whispers from across the ocean, built its trap. But such revelations came with a cost. The Kremlin now knew its communications were compromised. New encryption protocols were rushed out. Entire units were ordered to abandon digital coordination, relying instead on couriers and face-to-face briefings. It slowed them down. And in that atmosphere of suspicion, Ukraine found its greatest advantage yet, an enemy that feared itself. Still, the war was far from over. Their pride had been wounded, their aura of invincibility shattered, and wounded pride was dangerous. The U.S. Navy remained silent, its submarines still prowling the depths, waiting for the next move. As dawn broke on the second day after the trap, Ukrainian soldiers stood watch in silence. They were exhausted, battered, and yet unbroken. They knew the Russians would come again. They always did. But now, something had changed. The myth of Russian inevitability had been shattered. The 6:40 a.m. attack, meant to crush Ukraine, had instead become a symbol of resistance, timing, and a new kind of warfare. In the end, it wasn't just about artillery or drones or naval strikes. It was about a clock, a moment chosen by Russia, turned against them with brutal precision. A moment that would echo in history as the morning Ukraine refused to break. And far away, in the deep silence of the ocean, U.S. Navy submarines drifted on, unseen and unheard. Watching, waiting, knowing the clock would strike again.
They say history is written by the victors. But what if I told you, much of our history wasn't shaped by victory at all? What if it was shaped by human mistakes, decisions that went horribly wrong, accidents no one predicted, blunders that spiraled so far out of control they changed the course of entire civilizations? Some mistakes were born of arrogance, others of desperation, and some from a simple miscalculation that seemed meaningless at the time. But the consequences? They would echo for centuries. Imagine standing at the crossroads of history, holding a decision in your hands, completely unaware that a single choice, a single oversight, is about to rewrite the destiny of millions. From empires collapsing under their own hubris, to wars sparked by errors in judgment, to inventions unleashed without foreseeing their deadly consequences. Human mistakes have shaped the world we live in more than triumphs ever did. Tonight, we peel back the veil of time and uncover the biggest blunders in human history. Mistakes so catastrophic, so irreversible, that we still live with their consequences today. Let us begin where one man's arrogance destroyed one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. The year was 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, conqueror of Europe, a man who believed himself unstoppable, marched 500,000 soldiers into the heart of Russia. His plan was brilliant on paper: a swift campaign, a crushing victory, and the fall of Tsar Alexander I. But Napoleon made a mistake, a fatal mistake. He underestimated the Russian winter. At first, the invasion looked like a success. French forces stormed deep into Russia, winning battles, forcing the Russians to retreat. Napoleon believed he had victory in his grasp. But the Russians weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. And in their retreat, they burned everything: villages, crops, livestock, leaving the French army with nothing. As the months dragged on, the temperature plummeted. Food ran out. Horses collapsed in the snow. Soldiers froze where they stood. The Grand Army, once 500,000 strong, was reduced to a starving, desperate shadow of itself. By the time Napoleon limped back out of Russia, he had lost over 400,000 men. His empire would never recover. A single mistake, ignoring the power of the Russian winter, had shattered one of the greatest military forces in history. But Napoleon wasn't the first to make this mistake. Centuries earlier, another unstoppable conqueror, Mongol leader Batu Khan, had turned back from invading Europe because of the same brutal winters. History had already provided the warning. Napoleon simply didn't listen. Yet military blunders are only one kind of mistake. Some errors don't just cost battles, they cost empires. Take the fall of Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire had stood as a fortress between Europe and Asia. Its capital, Constantinople, was the most heavily fortified city in the world, protected by massive stone walls, a chain across its harbour, and a reputation for being impenetrable. But in 1453, a young Ottoman sultan named Mehmed II arrived at the gates with something new, something the Byzantines had never faced before: cannons. For centuries, the Byzantines had relied on their walls as their ultimate defense. No army had ever breached them. But Mehmed brought massive cannons, some so large they took hours to reload. The Byzantines had a choice. They could have invested in new defenses, developed gunpowder weapons of their own, or sought reinforcements from the west. But they hesitated. They believed their walls were enough. It was a mistake. For 7 weeks, the Ottomans pounded the city with cannon fire. The once unbreakable walls crumbled. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans stormed through, and Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire, which had lasted for over a millennium, was gone in a single day, all because they clung to the past, while their enemies embraced the future. Mistakes don't always come from arrogance. Sometimes they come from greed. And greed, more than anything, has reshaped history in ways we still feel today. Consider the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492, he believed he had reached Asia. He hadn't. He had stumbled upon an entire continent unknown to his world. At first, it seemed like a miracle: new lands, new resources, endless opportunities. But the Europeans made a mistake. They didn't see the native civilizations as equals. They saw them as obstacles. The pursuit of gold, silver, and land led to the near destruction of entire cultures. Diseases carried unknowingly by Europeans, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through the Americas, killing tens of millions. Some historians estimate that 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out. What began as a voyage of discovery turned into one of the deadliest mistakes in human history. Yet even this pales in comparison to a mistake made centuries later, when a single moment of human error nearly ended the world. October 27, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war. A Soviet submarine, cut off from Moscow and believing that war had already begun, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo at an American fleet. The captain was ready. The political officer agreed. Only one man stood in the way: Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command. He refused to authorize the launch. He argued, persuaded, and eventually convinced the others to wait. One man's refusal to make a fatal mistake may have saved humanity, because had that torpedo been launched, the US would have retaliated, and the world as we know it might have ended in a fiery nuclear holocaust. But not every mistake was avoided. In fact, some of the greatest errors in history came not from bold decisions, but from simple oversight. Take the Titanic. In 1912, it was called unsinkable. A marvel of engineering, a triumph of human progress. But the Titanic's designers made one critical mistake: they didn't include enough lifeboats. Regulations at the time only required lifeboats for about half the passengers, and the ship's owners didn't want the decks cluttered. After all, the Titanic was unsinkable. Why prepare for the impossible? We know how that story ends. April 14, 1912. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Over 1,500 people lost their lives. The unsinkable ship had sunk because of one arrogant mistake. And yet, the Titanic was just one ship. There was another mistake, far larger, far deadlier, that came not from arrogance, but from something far more dangerous: blind trust in human systems. World War I. The war to end all wars. It was sparked not by careful planning, but by a mistake. June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo. But the assassination itself was almost a failure. The first attempt with a bomb missed. The conspirators were scattered and demoralized. Hours later, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn, an accident, and stopped right in front of one of the assassins. Gavrilo Princip. He pulled out his pistol and fired. 2 shots. And with that mistake, a wrong turn, the world plunged into a war that would kill over 20 million people. A wrong turn. That's all it took. And yet, even that was just the beginning. Because mistakes don't end with the spark, they spread like wildfire. At the Battle of Gallipoli, Allied forces underestimated the terrain, the Turkish defense, and the sheer difficulty of the invasion. Thousands died in a campaign that was doomed before it began. In the trenches of Europe, generals clung to outdated tactics, sending wave after wave of men into machine gun fire. Mistake after mistake, and the bodies piled higher. By 1918, Europe was shattered. The war ended, but the mistakes weren't over. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to secure peace, instead humiliated Germany, imposed crushing reparations, and planted the seeds for an even greater catastrophe, World War II. A chain of mistakes, each one feeding the next. And in that war, humanity would make its most terrifying mistake yet.